What if the colors on an ancient wall were not just decoration, but a kind of message? What if the blue on a pharaoh's coffin was a chemical invention thousands of years ahead of its time? What if a glowing red on a temple mask came not from stone or plant, but from the crushed bodies of insects, traded like gold and guarded like secrets? These are not metaphors. These pigments exist. Some were made with knowledge we still do not fully understand. Others survived fire, flood, and centuries underground without fading. A few are so strange, they respond to light in ways that defy logic, behaving not like paint, but like technology. In this journey, we will follow the trail of 15 ancient pigments that refuse to be forgotten. From the shimmering blue of Egypt to the poison gold of Orpiment, from the soul-bound indigo of Africa to the cosmic purple that crowned emperors, these colors hold secrets written in chemistry, in ritual, and in silence. We will walk through tombs, temples, forgotten archives, and sunken workshops. We will ask how these pigments were made, why they were used, and what they meant to the people who shaped them. Because sometimes, the oldest colors tell the newest stories, and sometimes, a single drop of paint is all that remains of an entire world. The dust still clung to my boots when I first saw it, a ceiling carved from limestone and painted with a blue that had no business surviving 3,000 years. My torchlight caught the pigment just right, revealing a soft shimmer beneath the grime. It was deep and deliberate, not the faded ghost of a color, but a preserved breath from a time when pharaohs walked in twilight and the gods whispered in firelight. This was not Lapis Lazuli, nor was it crushed azurite or a blend from nature's usual palette. This was something else, something made. Egyptian blue, as modern scholars call it, was the first synthetic pigment ever created by human hands. Long before Rome rose, before Greece debated the soul and the atom, artisans of the Nile forged a hue that did not exist in the world until they imagined it into being. It began in the crucibles of ancient workshops, in kilns that roared beneath temple shadows. The formula was deceptively simple: silica, lime, copper, and a fluxing agent like natron or plant ash. But simplicity ends at the recipe. The real secret lay in the fire. The artisans needed temperatures between 800 and 1000 degrees Celsius. Any lower and the copper would not bond. Any higher and the mixture would collapse into glass. I found remnants of these failed attempts, slag heaps scattered like forgotten offerings, some scorched black, others cracked and useless. But when the formula succeeded, it birthed a pigment that caught and held light like the surface of still water beneath a moonless sky. And it endured. Egyptian blue has a crystalline structure that resists weather, erosion, and even time. It can still be seen on the walls of tombs in Saqqara, on coffins from Thebes, and in the shattered remnants of sculptures that once watched over lost cities. But that is not where its mystery ends. Modern science has studied this pigment with a growing sense of wonder. Under infrared light, Egyptian blue fluoresces. It glows with a ghostly radiance, invisible to the eye but unmistakable to the lens. This property has opened doors in photonics and biomedical imaging, linking the pigment of the ancients to the instruments of our future. We are beginning to see that this color was more than ornamental. It may have been intentional in ways we still do not fully grasp. Why was it always used to paint the sacred, the gods, the afterlife, the divine sky above? Was it merely symbolic? Or did the ancients understand something more, a hidden layer of perception, a spiritual wavelength? These are the questions that hum beneath the surface of every fragment we uncover. I held one of those fragments once, just a sliver of painted stone from a collapsed lintel, no larger than my palm, but the color still burned quietly, as if the fire that made it had not entirely gone out. I imagined the artisan, thousands of years ago, crouched beside the kiln, watching the heat build, listening to the hiss of mineral and flame. I wonder if they knew in that moment that they were not just painting a god's robe or a temple frieze, but leaving behind a signal for a world they would never see. Egyptian blue is not just a pigment. It is a whisper from the blue furnace, a message in light and chemistry from a civilization that mastered both. We decode what we can, but much remains sealed behind time's silence, and still it waits, gleaming faintly in the ruins, calling those who would look closer. The stone chamber was quiet, save for the wind slipping through the broken tiles above. I stepped carefully across the mosaic floor, its colors long faded, except for one. A band of vivid violet ran along the base of the wall. It had no right to be there, no right to shine so bright after 2,000 years. But there it was, hand purple, a pigment crafted in secrecy, its recipe lost to time and its properties stranger than fiction. It was first found clinging to statues buried with China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. Among the famous terracotta warriors, whose painted armor has mostly flaked away, small patches of deep purple remained untouched. For years, archaeologists puzzled over it. This was not a mineral pigment, not something scraped from the earth. It was synthetic, deliberate, and ancient. Han purple, known today by its chemical name barium copper silicate, was first made around the 3rd century BCE. Like Egyptian blue, it was created in kilns using extreme heat and precise conditions. But unlike Egyptian blue, Han purple was not just beautiful. It was complex, unstable, and in some ways unnatural. Modern analysis reveals something startling. Han purple behaves unlike any other pigment known to the ancient world. When exposed to intense magnetic fields at very low temperatures, it enters a quantum state, a condition physicists call dimensional reduction. In simple terms, it begins to act as though it exists in fewer dimensions than our physical world. From 3 dimensions, it drops into 2, then to 1. This is not science fiction. It is verified science, and it raises a question that whispers through the ruins. How could the artisans of the Han Dynasty have made something so strange, so precise, without ever knowing its deeper physics? Or did they? Did they sense something through ritual, through pattern, through intuition and fire? The pigment appears almost nowhere else. Unlike other ancient colors that were traded, copied, and passed down, Han purple was tightly bound to a place and a time. When the Han Dynasty fell, the recipe vanished. No written records remain. No oral tradition survived. Only these faint streaks of purple in tombs and fragments. A signature no one has been able to replicate exactly. Its ingredients include barium, a heavy metal rarely found in ancient pigments. To use it safely required knowledge or luck or both. Some believe Han purple was reserved for ceremonial or mystical purposes. The tombs where it is found often have celestial themes: stars, dragons, cosmic maps. Perhaps the color was seen as a bridge, a hue not of earth but of the heavens. I crouched beside the wall and touched the air just above the pigment. I imagined the hands that mixed it laboring in smoky workshops, grinding stones, tending fires. Did they know they were making something singular? Or were they simply repeating an inherited spell, passed down through generations of artisans who never wrote down what they knew. Han Purple challenges us. It is a relic that resists easy classification. It is both art and anomaly. It shimmers at the boundary between science and mystery. We understand its formula now, in part. We can reproduce it with modern tools. But its spirit, the moment of its discovery, the culture that birthed it, the reasons for its disappearance, those remain hidden. And perhaps that is the true secret of Han Purple. Not what it is, but what it meant, and how quickly the world can forget a color that once danced at the edge of dimensions. The scent of dust and stone filled the chamber, but it was the red that held my gaze. Deep crimson, almost bleeding into black in the corners where the torchlight could not reach. It coated the walls in wide, deliberate strokes, not faded, not muted, still alive. After more than 2 millennia, the color pulsed with an intensity that felt unnatural. This was Cinnabar, the red of emperors, alchemists, and tombs sealed with silence. I had first seen it on the lips of a statue in an abandoned shrine, later on the skin of mummified royalty buried beneath the Andes. The pigment spanned continents and centuries. From ancient China to Mesoamerica, Cinnabar was revered and feared. At its heart lies mercury sulfide, a natural mineral with a brilliance that defies erosion. Found in bright red veins within the earth, it was ground into a fine powder and mixed into paints, lacquers, and ceremonial pastes. It was not just pigment, it was transformation. A red so vivid it seemed to glow without light. The ancient Chinese called it Zhu. They painted imperial seals with it. They coated terracotta warriors in it. Taoist alchemists believed it held the secret to immortality. But this pursuit came with a price. Mercury is poison, slow and silent. Those who worked with it often suffered, their hands trembling, their minds unraveling. Yet still they used it again and again, as if the color itself demanded to be served. In Mesoamerican tombs, Cinnabar covered the faces of the dead. Skulls were painted red, bones dusted with crimson powder. Some believed it guided the soul to the afterlife. Others saw it as blood eternal, a symbol of divine passage. When I stood in one of those burial chambers, knee-deep in time, I imagined the ritual, the grinding of stone, the whisper of prayers, the red settling over the dead like a final breath. What is strange is how universal its symbolism became. In Rome, Cinnabar marked wealth and status. In Persia, it adorned manuscripts and royal walls. Even in prehistoric Europe, traces have been found in burial sites mixed with ochre, as if the earliest humans also knew the power of red. And yet, for all its beauty, Cinnabar is unstable. It darkens with sunlight. It weeps under humidity. Modern restorers struggle with it, trying to preserve what was once considered eternal. The paradox is haunting. A pigment believed to hold life forever, now threatened by exposure to the very world it once ruled. Science understands its structure now. We can recreate it. We can synthesize versions that are safer, more durable. But the mystery is not in its formula. It is in the choice. Why did so many ancient cultures, separated by oceans and time, choose this particular red? Was it the depth of its hue, or something deeper? An instinct, perhaps, that this color connected the living and the dead? I reached out and touched the edge of a painted sarcophagus, my glove brushing against the cinnabar. The pigment did not flake. It held firm, as if bound not just to the stone, but to the meaning behind it. A warning, a promise, a secret. Cinnabar is more than a color. It is a legacy of belief, of danger embraced in pursuit of eternity, the red that does not fade easily and refuses to be forgotten. Even now, in the half-light of ruins, it still speaks, not in words, but in hue, in presence, in the silent echo of rituals once performed beneath stars that no longer shine. The first time I saw it, I thought it was new. A splash of color on a crumbling temple wall, glowing with an unnatural brightness in the damp jungle air. But the ruins were ancient, the plaster cracked, the stone worn smooth by centuries of rain. Yet this blue, this impossible blue, had not faded. It was as if the sky itself had been captured and sealed into pigment. Maya blue, a color so vibrant and enduring it has survived centuries of heat, humidity, and time. While other paints peeled, flaked, or vanished into dust, Maya blue clung to murals, statues, and offerings as if determined not to be forgotten. And for centuries, it defied all attempts to understand it. I found it on the lid of a sacrificial altar in a temple buried beneath vines. The pigment coated the carved figures of gods and warriors, and more chillingly, the bones that still rested beneath the stone. The ancient Maya did not use this blue lightly. It was sacred, ritualistic, alive. At its core, Maya blue is a fusion, an alchemical marriage between two unlikely substances: indigo, the deep blue dye derived from plants, and polygorsite, a rare clay found in parts of Mesoamerica. On their own, both are fragile. Indigo fades, clay cracks, but somehow when mixed and heated, they become something new, a pigment with molecular bonds so tight that even acid rain and tropical heat cannot undo them. The process was lost for centuries, not written down, not passed on. Only in the late 20th century did scientists finally begin to unravel the secret. It was not just chemistry, it was timing, heat, ritual. The mixture had to be dried, then baked at precise temperatures. Too low and the bond would not form. Too high and it would burn away. The artisans who first made it were not guessing. They were repeating a process they knew intimately, though no record tells us how they learned. The pigment appears again and again in Maya sites, on temple walls, in murals depicting creation myths, on ceremonial pottery, and most hauntingly, on the victims of human sacrifice. During sacred ceremonies, the bodies of those offered to the gods were often painted in Maya blue before being laid upon the altars or lowered into cenotes. It was more than decoration. It was transformation. The color symbolized the sky, the divine, the eternal. Why did they go to such lengths to create it? Why choose a pigment that required such precision, such labor, such reverence? I stood beneath a painted archway in an abandoned city and watched the blue flicker in the changing light. It felt less like paint and more like presence, a fragment of sky, frozen in stone. What strikes me most is how modern science still marvels at it. No other pigment from the ancient world has survived with such resilience in such hostile conditions. And yet, even with the recipe in hand, we cannot quite replicate its soul. We can make the color, but we cannot make it speak the way theirs did. Maya blue is not just a marvel of chemistry. It is a window into a worldview. A culture that saw color not as surface, but as symbol, as spirit, as sky made solid. When I left the ruins, I glanced back one last time at the fading mural, still gleaming in the midday heat. The figures had worn away, the outlines blurred, but the blue remained, watching, waiting, whispering stories we have only begun to understand. And I knew then Maya blue is not a pigment. It is a living sky still breathing through stone. The village was quiet when I arrived. Just the wind through the reed roofs and the soft clink of tools at work. But I followed the scent, sharp, earthy, and bitter, to a small courtyard where vats bubbled under the sun. A woman stirred the liquid with a long wooden pole, and as I watched, the blue began to bloom. Not in the water itself, which remained a murky green, but in the cloth she lifted into the air. Indigo. It was like watching color rise from shadow. Indigo is not just a pigment. It is a process, a ritual, a transformation, born not from fire like other ancient colors, but from fermentation, patience, and time. For thousands of years, across dozens of cultures, indigo was treated as more than dye. It was the mark of spirit, of class, of mystery, a blue so deep it bordered on the metaphysical. I traced its journey through time, from the Nile's banks, where it dyed the linens of the dead, to the Indian subcontinent, where vats of indigo once turned entire rivers dark. In West Africa, it adorned the garments of priestesses and kings. In Central America, it was sacred to the Maya. And everywhere it went, it carried more than color. It carried meaning. The plant itself does not look like much. Indigofera tinctoria, a leggy shrub with small leaves. But the magic is in those leaves. When harvested, they are soaked, fermented, then beaten to release indicantanium, a compound that, when exposed to oxygen, shifts from yellow to blue before your eyes. The process is delicate. It requires a practiced hand. Too much agitation, and the dye breaks. Too little, and it will never bind. That is the secret. Indigo does not stain the surface. It binds at the molecular level, sinking into the fibers like memory into bone. Once it takes hold, it does not fade easily. I held a scrap of cloth dyed in the ancient way, and the blue had not dimmed after centuries. Worn smooth by time, yes, but still there, still watching. And this permanence gave indigo its weight. In many cultures, it was believed to protect the soul, to ward off spirits. In Mali, cloth dyed with indigo was worn during rites of passage, during birth, death, and initiation. In ancient Egypt, it was used to mark the wrappings of the dead. And in Japan, indigo was used to dye the robes of samurai, believed to offer strength and healing. But there is a shadow in the story too. Because indigo was precious, it became power. And where there is power, there is often suffering. In colonial eras, indigo became a currency. Grown under forced labor, its plantations infamous for cruelty. The color that once marked the sacred became the mark of conquest. Yet the plant endured, the pigment endured, and in quiet villages the old ways continued, hidden in courtyards and passed down by hand. I watched as another cloth was lifted from the vat, the air turning it blue like a whispered prayer. The woman looked up at me, her hands stained with dye. She smiled, then went back to her work. For her, it was not chemistry, it was inheritance, the soul's mark, left by those who came before. Indigo is more than a pigment. It is a transformation made visible. From green leaf to blue cloth, from craft to legacy. And once it touches something, fabric, skin, or memory, it does not let go. Even now, in the quiet places of the world, it still rises not from fire, but from water and patience. A blue that does not shout but endures. A reminder that some colors are not worn. They are woven into the spirit. The sun was low when I reached the coast, casting bronze light over the ruins of an old Phoenician port. The air smelled of salt, stone, and something else, something pungent, buried in the earth and the past. I walked among broken vats carved from rock, now overgrown with wild grass, and imagined them full again, brimming with brine and the crushed bodies of countless sea snails. This was where empires dyed their power. This was where they made Tyrian Purple. It began with a shell, the murex, a small, spiny sea snail that clung to rocky shores. Its secret was hidden deep within, in a gland no larger than a grain of rice. When crushed and fermented under the right conditions, it released a fluid that turned green, then blue, and finally settled into the deepest purple known to the ancient world, a hue that did not wash away, a color that clung to cloth like blood clings to memory. The process was brutal. Tens of thousands of snails were needed to produce enough dye for a single rope. The stench from the workshops was so strong that dye houses were often built far from city centers. But the result was color that glowed with an otherworldly sheen, shifting between crimson and violet depending on the light. Tyrian Purple was more than beautiful. It was alive. Worn by kings, emperors, and high priests, it became a symbol of divinity and dominion. In Rome, only the emperor could wear it. To don Tyrian Purple without permission was an act of treason, a death sentence. Even the Senate, though cloaked in power, was barred from its full use. Purple became law, a boundary between rulers and the ruled. But why this color? Why purple? Some say it mirrored the twilight sky, that place between day and night, between life and afterlife. Others point to its rarity, its cost, the labor it demanded. It was power condensed into pigment, the blood of empire woven into fabric. I traced my hand over a broken shard of amphora, stained faintly with violet. Perhaps it once carried the precious dye. Perhaps it fell during a raid or was tossed aside after the vats dried up. The Phoenicians guarded the recipe with obsession. Even today, we do not fully know every step of their process. Modern attempts have replicated the dye, but something remains elusive, a detail, a timing, a gesture lost in time. The last known Tyrian Purple workshop closed over 1,000 years ago. As empires fell and trade routes shifted, the dye vanished from use. Cheaper pigments took its place, but its memory lingered. The word purple itself in many languages still echoes its origins, and the myths it inspired, of gods transformed by color, of seas that bled into robes, continue to haunt the edges of history. What remains are the traces, a fragment of cloth in a desert tomb, a faint stain in a ruined vat, and in the minds of those who chase history's color, a question that will not rest. What was it like to wear that purple? To feel the weight of 1,000 lives crushed for the sake of a single garment? Tyrian Purple was more than pigment. It was the visible thread of empire, of conquest, of belief. A dye pulled from the ocean, stained by sacrifice, and stitched into the skin of rulers. And though its recipe is faded, its legend is not. In the silence of that coastal ruin, with waves lapping against the stone, I felt it still, not in sound, not in sight, but in presence. The purple that once bled from snails and built thrones still lingers, waiting in the cracks for someone to listen. I bent down beside the stone and brushed away the loose soil. Beneath the dust, a handprint emerged, pressed into the wall of a shallow cave, its outline painted in a red so rich it seemed to throb with memory. It had been left there over 20,000 years ago, and yet it still held its shape, still said, "I was here, I lived, I touched this world, and I left my mark." The pigment was ochre, one of the earliest colors ever used by human hands. It was not synthesized, not altered in some distant kiln. It was drawn directly from the earth, scraped from iron-rich stone, ground into powder, and mixed with fat, water, or blood. It came in shades of red, yellow, and brown, and wherever early humans went, ochre followed. From the cliffs of Australia to the plains of Africa, from Paleolithic Europe to the buried tombs of ancient China, ochre marked bodies, tools, and ritual spaces. Long before language was carved into clay or stone, color spoke, and it spoke in ochre. Some of the oldest burials ever discovered are lined with red ochre, bodies placed with care, dusted in pigment, as if to return the dead to the womb of the earth. To some ancient cultures, ochre was more than decoration. It was life force. It symbolized blood, vitality, the bridge between body and spirit. In Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found ochre stones etched with cross-hatched patterns over 70,000 years old. Nearby, small shells, once strung as beads, were stained with pigment. These were not random stains. They were intentional, worn as symbols, perhaps of rank, perhaps of identity, perhaps of mourning, or maybe all at once. The power of ochre lies not just in its presence, but in its persistence. It resists decay. It clings to stone and bone through centuries of wind and water. I once held a fragment of ochre-painted pottery, its color still vivid after 3,000 years underground. It felt warm in my hand, like the earth still remembered. But not all ochre was sacred. In some cultures it was utilitarian, a sunblock, a preservative, a bud repellent. It was smeared on skin before hunts, on tools before battle. It was part of daily life, woven into survival. And yet even then, it was not just practical, it was symbolic. It marked thresholds. It signaled transitions. It meant something. What is astonishing is how consistent its use was across time and space. Cultures that never touched the same soil, that never spoke the same language, and yet they all reached for the same color, the red of iron, the red of life, the red of return. Some scientists suggest our connection to ochre may even be neurological, a built-in recognition of red as a signal, of blood, of danger, of fertility. But whatever the cause, the effect is clear. Ochre is one of the oldest bridges between the inner world and the outer one. I stepped back from that handprint in the cave and let the silence settle around me. It was not art I was looking at. It was intention, a ritual gesture made by someone who stood where I stood now, who saw the same stone, who reached for the same earth and made it speak. Ochre was their voice, their shield, their offering. And as I left the cave, the color followed me, in my mind, in the dust on my boots, in the knowledge that this earth still holds memory, if we know how to see it. The scent hit me first, not rot or damp stone, but something sharp, metallic, like a storm breaking open over bronze. I was deep within a ruin, a collapsed villa along the Aegean coast. The walls were crumbling, the ceiling half lost, but a fresco clung to one surviving column. Its paint had faded in patches, the reds dulled, the yellows gone, but a strange green still danced in the cracks, soft, shimmering, almost alive. Verdigris. The pigment born from copper's decay. A green that grows not from plants or minerals, but from corrosion, from transformation. It is not mined, it is coaxed. Ancient artisans understood this. They hung copper plates in sealed pots above vinegar, allowing time, moisture, and acid to do the work. Weeks would pass, then a powder would form, bluish at first, then green, ready to be scraped and turned into paint. It was used with care, on manuscripts, walls, icons, and glass. In ancient Greece and Rome, verdigris appeared on murals and statues, marking foliage, garments, and sacred symbols. It glowed against stone in a way few colors could, but it came with a warning. It was unstable. Moisture could ruin it. Light could darken it. Time could turn it to dust. And yet, when it held, it held. I saw it in Byzantine manuscripts, the delicate vines twisting between words, still bright after 1,000 years. I saw it on the armor of a Roman fresco, where the green still clung to the curve of a painted shield. Even now, in museums and ruins, it appears like a ghost, subtle but undeniable. The ancients called it by different names. Greeks knew it as Ios Chalkeos, meaning the violet of copper. The Romans called it erugo, or simply green rust. And medieval alchemists saw it as a sign, a hint that metals could change, that transmutation was possible. In their hands, verdigris became more than pigment. It became philosophy. But verdigris had another side. It could eat through parchment, it could turn to poison, and its beauty was fleeting unless carefully preserved. This gave it an almost mythical status, desirable, dangerous, and temperamental. Artists loved it and feared it. Some recipes from the Middle Ages even advised whispering prayers while mixing it, as if the pigment could hear or choose when to behave. In some regions, it was even used in medicine, a practice that, today, seems unthinkable. Ground verdigris was applied to wounds or mixed into salves. It is hard to say whether this was superstition or desperation, but it shows how blurred the line once was between art and healing, between color and cure. I once found a palette buried beneath the tiles of a collapsed workshop. The pigments were dried and cracked but still recognizable, red ochre, black soot, and in one corner a crumb of green powder, verdigris. The artist who left it may have been interrupted by fire, or war, or silence, but the color remained, waiting. It is easy to forget how alive copper is, how it breathes, how it changes. Verdigris is the evidence, a reminder that even decay can create beauty, that what breaks down can also become something more. As I stepped out of that ruin, the wind shifted, and I smelled it again, that sharp electric scent. Somewhere metal was changing. Somewhere copper was whispering its secret to the air. And I knew then, verdigris is not just pigment, it is a lesson. A transformation caught in color, the green of change, of time, of what lies just beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. It glinted beneath the torchlight like buried treasure, a soft yellow shimmer hiding in the grooves of a carved tablet buried for centuries beneath sand and silence. At first, I mistook it for gold, a flash of something precious in the dark. But gold does not smear like this. Gold does not cling to your gloves. This was orpiment, a pigment so beautiful it seduced emperors and alchemists alike, and so toxic it could kill them just as easily. Orpiment is the fire-born marriage of arsenic and sulfur, a mineral pulled from the earth in brilliant golden shards, soft enough to crumble beneath the fingers, but radiant enough to rival the sun. It was once thought to hold mystical power. Some believed it was a kind of solidified light. Others called it the alchemist's gold, a substance that hinted at the philosopher's stone. But beneath its beauty lay danger. The word orpiment comes from the Latin ori pigmentum, golden pigment. It was mined in Persia, in China, in the deserts of Anatolia. Ground into powder, it became a color too rich to ignore. Artists used it to paint silk, to gild manuscripts, to catch the divine glint of halos and robes. In ancient China, it adorned the walls of royal tombs. In the Islamic world, it was used to illuminate the sacred words of holy texts. And yet, those who handled it paid a price. The dust was deadly. The fumes from grinding it, from heating it, from mixing it into paint, all could poison the lungs, the skin, the blood. Still, it was used, desired, worshipped. Because it did what few other pigments could, it shimmered like real gold. But it was malleable, it could be controlled, bent to the artist's will. I once examined a scroll from the Tang dynasty, its edges fraying with time, but the orpiment still glowing between the calligraphy like the last embers of a dying star. The pigment had not dulled, it had not cracked, but it had eaten into the paper, leaving scars beneath the surface. That was the other danger. Orpiment does not sleep, it reacts. Over time, it can consume what it touches. Despite this, it continued to appear in the palettes of painters from Rome to Kyoto. Its color was unmatched, and there were few alternatives. Real gold was too expensive. Yellow ochre was too dull. Lead tin yellow was unstable. Only orpiment gave that golden flame, that sense of otherworldly brilliance. Some medieval artists left warnings in their notes. Do not store it near silver. Do not mix it with copper. Do not breathe as you grind it. Yet they used it all the same. They took the risk. Because sometimes beauty demands a price. And sometimes that price is paid in silence, over years, in hands that tremble and lungs that forget how to breathe. I found a chunk of raw orpiment once in the ruins of a collapsed monastery, stored in a sealed jar beside fragments of broken glass and the bones of brushes. The jar had not been opened in centuries, but the color inside, it burned like the sun, untouched, unfaded, as if the pigment itself refused to grow old. Orpiment is not just color, it is contradiction, life and death, light and poison, the gold that is not gold, but something more elusive, more haunting, a warning written in brilliance. And so, as I left the chamber, I sealed the jar again. I placed it back beneath the stones, not out of fear, but respect, because some colors are not meant to be handled lightly. Some were never meant to serve. Orpiment is one of them. The gold of arsenic and the silence that follows. The stone was cold in my palm, smooth, weighty, the color of a midnight sky just before the stars appear. Flecks of gold caught the lantern light, not paint, not illusion, but pyrite embedded in a sea of deep blue. This was Lapis Lazuli, a stone more ancient than most empires, a pigment so rare and sacred that it once cost more than gold, and every time it appears in art it carries a message, not just of beauty, but of longing, of reverence, of a journey written in color. Its origin lies in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the rugged cliffs of the Badakhshan region. For over 6,000 years, people have mined this stone from veins hidden beneath the rock. There are no other places on Earth where lapis of this purity and intensity is found in such abundance. From there, it traveled, on the backs of camels, in the holds of merchant ships, through deserts and empires and the inked scrolls of scribes who never saw its source. It was not always used for pigment. In Mesopotamia, it was carved into seals and beads, offered to gods and buried with kings. The Egyptians ground it into powder, mixing it into cosmetics and amulets. But it was in the hands of medieval artists that lapis became something transcendent, transformed into ultramarine, literally beyond the sea. It became the most prized blue in the world. To make it into paint was an ordeal. The stone had to be crushed, washed, sifted, and mixed with oils and wax. The pigment had to be separated from impurities by hand. It could take days to extract even a few grams. But the result? The result was a blue that defied time. Deep, vibrant, unyielding. I once stood before a 15th century altarpiece in a dim chapel. The robes of the Virgin Mary were painted in ultramarine, glowing softly in the flickering candlelight. The walls around it had faded. The gold leaf had cracked. But the blue still sang. In that color was not just wealth or devotion. There was awe, a reaching toward the divine. In many commissions, the blue was reserved for the holiest subjects. Artists would paint entire backgrounds in cheaper pigments, saving ultramarine for the folds of sacred robes, for halos, for skies that were not of this world. Patrons would pay extra for it. Sometimes artists had to plead for more, or ration it carefully, painting in layers so thin they were nearly invisible. But beyond the material, there is something spiritual in lapis lazuli. Its depth invites reflection. Its shimmer echoes starlight. The ancients believed it held the essence of the heavens, that to wear it or paint with it was to align oneself with eternity. In some burial sites, lapis was found resting over the eyes of the dead, a guide for the soul perhaps, a map for the stars. And still, it endures. Even now, in modern laboratories and restoration studios, ultramarine made from true lapis is treasured. Synthetic versions exist, of course. They are cheaper, more consistent, but they do not carry the same weight. They do not speak with the same voice. Lapis lazuli is not just a pigment, it is a story in stone, a journey from mountain to monastery, from mine to manuscript. It is a fragment of the cosmos, gifted to Earth and shaped by human hands into something almost eternal. As I tucked the fragment back into its velvet case, I felt its coolness linger, a reminder that somewhere in the silence of the hills, under layers of dust and time, the starry journey of blue still begins, one stone at a time. It was hidden in the cracks of a temple wall, beneath soot, lime, and time. A patch of blue, barely the size of my thumb, glowing faintly under the beam of my lamp. Most would pass it by. But I had seen it before, on statues, on sarcophagi, on the broken shards of ancient tiles. It was Egyptian blue, one of the oldest synthetic pigments known to humanity. But now, after thousands of years, it is revealing something unexpected. It is not only ancient, it is futuristic. Egyptian blue was first created over 4,500 years ago. It appeared during the dawn of dynastic Egypt, in the paint of tombs, the ornaments of pharaohs, and the murals of gods. The formula is surprisingly elegant, a mixture of quartz sand, copper compounds, lime, and a flux like natron, heated to intense temperatures until the mixture fuses into a blue glass, which is then crushed into pigment. For centuries, it was used for its beauty, its resilience, its light-fast glow, but only recently have scientists begun to discover what the ancients could never have imagined. When exposed to near-infrared light, Egyptian blue emits a radiant fluorescence that is invisible to the naked eye, but detectable with specialized cameras. It is the only ancient pigment known to behave this way, and this changes everything. In laboratories around the world, researchers are now studying Egyptian blue not just as an artifact, but as a tool. Its unique optical properties allow it to be used in biomedical imaging, in solar energy collection, and even in modern security features. It can be layered onto surfaces to harvest invisible light. It can be embedded in systems that detect subtle shifts in radiation. It is becoming part of the future. How could a pigment forged in the furnaces of ancient Thebes become a material in next-generation technologies? The answer lies not just in its chemistry, but in its structure. Egyptian blue is made of tiny crystals that align in sheets. These sheets allow electrons to move and release light in very specific ways. In essence, what the ancient artisans created for visual splendor turns out to have nanostructures perfectly suited to modern science. And yet, the most haunting question remains: did the Egyptians know something more? Did they notice, even without the tools we have now, that this pigment behaved strangely under different light? Did they observe it glowing in firelight or responding in unusual ways during rituals? We may never know. But the pigment seems to remember. I held a vial of it once, recreated in a modern lab, identical in structure to the ancient formula. It looked just like the dust I had brushed from a limestone wall a continent away. But this dust was now being tested in fiber optics, in cancer detection, in satellite materials. The line between artifact and innovation had blurred. Egyptian blue is a message sent forward in time, not just of artistic achievement, but of untapped potential, a signal buried in the ruins, now answering questions we did not even know to ask. As I stood at the edge of the excavation watching the last light slip behind the horizon, I thought of the artisans who first poured molten sand and copper together. They were chasing beauty, maybe something divine. And yet, unknowingly, they left behind a key, a pigment that still illuminates, still teaches, still glows. The pigment that became technology is not just a relic, it is a reminder that what we call ancient may still be ahead of us. The cave opened with a hush, as if the mountain had been holding its breath for centuries. I stepped inside, past the hanging roots and slick stone, and into a world painted not with brushstrokes but with intention. On the walls were the silhouettes of animals, marked in ochre, black, and manganese red. There were no signatures, no words, only shapes, symbols, and color. But in those ancient marks lay a question that has haunted every pigment I have studied. What did these colors mean? Not just how were they made or what minerals they used, but what they were meant to say. The deeper I went into the history of ancient pigments, the more I realized we are not just looking at materials, we are mining meaning. We are standing at the edge of someone else's vision, trying to see what they saw and why they chose to record it in color. In nearly every culture, color has carried weight beyond aesthetics. Red was not just red, it was blood, it was birth, it was danger and divinity. Blue was sky, spirit, absence, and immortality. Yellow could be light or disease. Green could signal fertility or the underworld. Pigments were never passive. They were part of a language we are only beginning to translate. And often, that language did not survive the fall of empires. The recipes were passed down from master to apprentice, painted on temple walls, stored in coded manuscripts. But when cultures collapsed or were erased, the meanings were lost. The color remained. The message faded. I found a small palette once, buried in a collapsed villa in the Highlands. It was made of polished bone, its surface stained with rings of blue, black, and rust. Nearby lay a small stylus and a broken ceramic dish. Whoever used it was not just making images, they were writing with color. But what were they saying? Some pigments were reserved only for the elite. Tyrian Purple marked the emperor. Ultramarine was saved for the divine. Cinnabar spoke of transformation. These rules were known, embedded in ritual. But in the quiet margins of society, others were experimenting. Dyes mixed in alleyway vats, colors blended by trial, by vision, by instinct. Meaning was not fixed. It was evolving. It was alive. That is what I have come to believe. That pigment is not merely material. It is memory. It is belief. It is emotion suspended in mineral. Every time I uncover a fragment of painted wall or brush the dirt from a faded textile, I wonder who mixed that color, why they chose it, what they hoped it would preserve. Was it protection? Was it love? Was it fear? Modern science helps us analyze. We can break pigments into spectra, we can name their compounds, we can replicate their tones, but the moment of intention, the reason for their use, often escapes us. We can hold the same stone, the same dye, and still not understand what it meant. In that cave, I sat beneath the painted herd and watched the light from my lantern flicker against the red shapes. The pigments had not moved in 10,000 years, but something in them felt alive. Not in a literal sense, but in the way a story feels when you know it is not over. This is what the mining of meaning truly is. Not extraction, not possession, but listening to what the past tried to say, in color, in silence, and in the places where the brush met the stone. The floor tiles crunched underfoot as I stepped into the ruined atrium. Pillars lay in pieces, vines curled through cracked mosaics, but on the far wall, barely shielded from wind and rain, a mural still clung to life. Faded, fractured, but not silent. Reds traced the folds of a soldier's cloak. A soft blue lingered in the background. Gold leaf, long since dulled, hinted at light once cast on marble. This was not just art, it was empire, spoken in pigment. Throughout history, color has been more than aesthetic. It has been political, strategic, a declaration. The empires of the ancient world understood this. Rome, Persia, Byzantium, China, they did not merely conquer land. They painted their presence across every surface they touched. Their pigments were not just ingredients, they were statements. In Rome, walls were colored with cinnabar, Egyptian blue, and ochres shipped from Africa and beyond. These pigments were expensive. Some came from territories recently subdued. The frescoes in a Roman villa were not just decoration, they were proof of reach, of wealth, of dominion. If you could color your walls with dyes pulled from the ends of the empire, you belonged to its center. In China, imperial yellows were reserved for the emperor alone. The recipes for these pigments were guarded secrets. To use the wrong color in the wrong context could be seen as rebellion. Entire bureaucracies existed to control the use and distribution of color. The pigment became law, and through law, it became identity. In the Islamic Golden Age, colors were used to mark spiritual harmony and mathematical perfection. Dooms were tiled in lapis blue and verdigris green, echoing the heavens. Geometry and pigment worked together, a visual language that blended the sacred with the scientific. Here, color was not just control, it was vision, an articulation of cosmic order. Even the British Empire, centuries later, used pigment to map and maintain power. Indigo, grown and processed in colonized lands, was turned into dye and exported in vast quantities. The people who harvested it did not wear it. It clothed the colonizers. It marked uniforms and banners. The color was not only extracted from the land, it was extracted from the people. I found records in an old ledger, its ink faded, listing pigment shipments from Alexandria to Rome, ochre, lead white, vermilion, and a curious entry labeled Purpura Regia, royal purple. Each entry was a story of trade, labor, risk, and control. Color was commodity, and commodity built empire. But for all their grandeur, these palettes were fragile. When empires fell, their colors scattered. Some recipes were forgotten, others were outlawed. Some colors vanished altogether, known only by name or in the ghost traces left on broken walls. Yet even in their ruin, these pigments endure. I have seen the same shade of blue on a Roman fresco on a mosque ceiling centuries apart. I have seen the same red on an Etruscan tomb and a colonial uniform. The colors outlast the flags. They resist the silence. And that is the paradox. Empire seeks to shape the world in its image. But color, once released, becomes its own force. It migrates, it adapts, it whispers new meanings through time. The palette of empire is not just power made visible, it is power unraveling, layer by layer, shade by shade, until all that remains is the pigment waiting for someone to listen. In that ruined atrium, I let my fingers hover above the painted stone, not to take, not to restore, but to remember that even the greatest empires fade, but color finds a way to remain. The stone temple sat at the edge of the jungle, half swallowed by vines and silence. The carvings were worn, the steps had collapsed. But deep inside, where the air was still and cool, I found it, a smear of pigment on a ceremonial mask, a red unlike any I had seen before. Not the deep crimson of Cinnabar, not the rust of ochre. This was brighter, wound-colored, vivid, as if it had just been painted. It was the last color of the old world, the final hue made before everything changed. This was cochineal. To the people of the Andes and Mesoamerica, it was sacred, extracted not from mineral, but from life, the crushed bodies of tiny insects that lived on the prickly pear cactus. Each insect, no larger than a grain of rice, held a drop of crimson dye. It took thousands to dye a single garment, but the color it yielded was unlike anything else, a red so intense it seemed to breathe. Long before ships crossed oceans, this color adorned the robes of priests, the skins of statues, the pages of sacred codices. In markets of the Aztec Empire, cakes of dried cochineal were traded like currency. It was not just a pigment, it was power. And like all power, it would draw eyes from far away. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they were struck not just by the gold in the temples, but by the color, the red that refused to fade, the dye that clung to fabric through time and wear. They took it, harvested it, shipped it across the sea. And in Europe, cochineal became obsession. Painters used it to render the blood of Christ in oil. Monarchs demanded it for their robes. The dye was so valuable that, for a time, it ranked just below silver in the cargo ledgers of colonial trade, and yet its origin remained shrouded in secrecy. The Spanish guarded the source fiercely. For centuries, Europeans debated whether it came from a berry, a fungus, or a worm. Few guessed the truth. But as it spread, so too did the silence. The temples where it once held spiritual weight were emptied. The rituals faded. The people who had first cultivated the cactus and the insect were enslaved or erased. The red endured, but its meaning changed. It became fashion, it became profit, and the old world it once adorned receded into shadow. I once held a textile woven in the highlands dyed with cochineal centuries ago. The threads were worn, the patterns faded, but the red still blazed. It had not dimmed. It did not ask permission to survive. Cochineal is a paradox. It is both ancient and extracted, revered and exploited, a color that lived and lives still, in lipstick, in fabric, in the ink of old manuscripts and the shadows of lost temples. But for me, it will always be the last color, the one made at the edge of history, before ships arrived, before the old names were forgotten, before the sacred turned to commerce. As I left that temple and stepped back into the light, the jungle closed behind me. The birds called overhead, the vines crept quietly, and I carried with me a single thought, that colors remember, even when we do not. The last color of the old world is not lost. It waits in the folds of cloth, in the dust of frescoes, in the blood of insects and the roots of memory, still vivid, still alive, still whispering. It was tucked beneath a slab of broken stone, wrapped in oilcloth and brittle with age. A ledger, not ornate, not gilded, just a slim book with curled pages and ink faded by damp air and years of silence. I found it in a ruined archive deep beneath what was once a monastery, the ground floor long collapsed. But this had survived, and in it, a record not of prayers or kings, but of pigments. Ochre, Cinnabar, Lazuli, Indigo, names repeated like a chant across its pages. Alongside them were numbers, weights, notes in a hand so fine it felt reverent. Here was a glimpse into a life built around color, a record of what was bought, what was mixed, what was painted. Yet nowhere in these pages did it say why. No mention of the painting, no image, just materials, costs, shipments, as if the soul of the work had been stripped away, leaving only the bones. I sat there for a long time, listening to the wind slip through the broken walls above me. I turned the pages slowly, careful not to crack them. There were fragments of recipes, a measure of vinegar to deepen the blue, a warning not to mix Orpiment with Verdigris. There was a note about a shipment delayed by snow, and then, halfway through, a blot of dried pigment pressed between two leaves. A fingerprint, blue, still bright. Someone had touched the page with stained hands. A moment frozen. This ledger was not unique. Others exist, scattered across museums and archives, in forgotten drawers and sealed vaults, quiet books filled with numbers and color names. And in them, we see the machinery of memory, the infrastructure behind the paintings we admire on walls and ceilings. The color was not magic. It was work. It was chemistry. It was trade. And it was often paid for in coin, blood, and time. Yet for all that precision, these ledgers rarely reveal what we seek. They do not tell us what the colors meant to those who used them. They do not explain why a certain hue was chosen for a robe, or a sky, or a god. That part remains unwritten. These books, for all their detail, are silent where it matters most. But sometimes silence speaks, in the gaps, in the repeated orders of a rare pigment, in the sudden appearance of cochineal in a region that had never seen it before, in the missing pages, in the changed handwriting after a war. These are clues, not answers, but paths. And that is what the ledger offers, not knowledge, but direction. I closed the book gently and set it back in its place among the rubble and moss. I did not take it. It belongs to the earth now, to the silence it keeps. But I left a note of its coordinates in my journal. Someone else may find it. Someone else may listen. The silent ledger is not just a record of materials, it is a story of labor, of movement, of forgotten hands who ground stone into dust so a god could be robed in blue, so a martyr's blood could be painted in red that would not fade, so an empire could see itself reflected in gold. We may never know their names, but their colors remain, in ledgers, in ruins, in the fragments they left behind, and in the silence between their lines, we begin to hear their voice. The light is fading now. The ruins behind me sink back into shadow, and the pages of my journal grow heavy in my hands. 15 colors, 15 paths through time, and yet I feel as though I have only brushed the surface. Every pigment we uncovered was more than chemistry. Each one was a choice, a belief, a whisper of something sacred or forbidden or simply beautiful. And behind every hue were hands, ancient hands, mixing, grinding, layering, hoping the color would last, hoping it would speak when words could not. That is what strikes me most. These colors have endured longer than the kingdoms that made them. They have survived fire, flood, theft, and silence. They have outlived the languages that once named them, and they still speak. But what do they say? Not facts, not dates. What they offer is presence, a kind of breath held in stone and paint, a moment of connection between us and those who lived and died before memory began. In that sense, pigments are not just artistic, they are archaeological, they are spiritual. They are reminders that humans have always searched for meaning, and that meaning often arrived in color before it did in words. There is something deeply humbling about that. To know that what you see in a cracked wall or a faded scroll once moved someone to silence or to song, to wonder what it meant to them, and to feel it stir something in you now. So I leave this chapter here, but not finished. Because the colors are not finished. They still wait, sealed in tombs and jars and rock faces that have not yet been touched. They wait in places no map will show. And when we find them, they will not shout, they will whisper. And if we listen, we may remember, history does not whisper, it waits. And color remembers everything.